Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our presentation this cloudy afternoon here in Wisconsin. For those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Sandy Haas, and I am currently the Executive Director of UWRA and your host. In addition to our distinguished speakers, Program Coordinator Tom Eggert, who also is a speaker today, is with me. It is my pleasure to introduce a member of the Retirement Opportunities Committee, who is not only serving as today's program coordinator, but also one of our speakers. Please join me in welcoming Tom Eggert. Tom, it's all yours.
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Richard and I are old friends, and we are returning to a theme that we have talked about in the past, sort of a point-counterpoint on the role of nuclear power in the energy future. And I think you'll find that we agree on a lot of items, but there are a couple of items that we are quite diametrically opposed. And that's what the session is about. Richard is, he's a very talented emeritus professor of radiation oncology. He taught and worked with the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine prior to his retirement. And since 2010, so 13 years, he's been leading a discussion group through Plato, which I always view Plato as sort of the parallel organization to our organization, to UWRA, called Pathways to a Sustainable Planet. And part of I think Richard's interest in the class that he leads through Plato is the role of nuclear power in the energy mix, and as we look to the future. He'll talk a little bit more about himself, but I just want to add, Richard is really committed to this stuff. He drives an electric car, he flies an electric plane, and I don't dismiss at all his perspectives on nuclear power. So Richard, let me just say the format we'll use, we'll each take a 2-minute introduction. We'll then do a 20-minute presentation for each of us. We will each then have a 5-minute response to the other person's presentation, and then we'll close with a 2-minute closing. That should take us about the first hour. Then we're hoping that there are questions that have been generated from the points that we've made, what we've talked about, and we'd like to address those questions in the second hour. So please do submit your questions. Don't be offended if we don't get to them during the presentation part, but we will try and get to all of the questions during the second hour of the session. So with that, Richard, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I do appreciate your kind introduction, and I look forward to being able to share my screen. Here we are. Yeah, so I've already helped myself with the first slide, introducing myself as Richard Steeves. The more important parts are, why am I here today and why do I care? Well, Tom has already helped me with the first question. We have debated before, and I'm here at his invitation, and I'm happy to do that. What I also want to elaborate on in this introduction is, why do I care? My specialty training in radiation oncology allows me to be familiar with linear accelerators and radioactive isotopes in the treatment of cancer, and have a certain respect for it, of course, but also to be able to use these materials without fear. I have held radium in my gloved hand in order to treat people with uterine cancer. I've helped to build insertions for what are called brachytherapy, that is short-range radiation from these isotopes. So I'm quite familiar with using them. Also, my graduate training at the University of Toronto helped me to understand whole body radiation as an alternative in the study of leukemia in inbred mice. I should say also that I'm quite familiar with photovoltaic solar system. I've had one on my garage roof for 15 years. I have special gauges on it that give me information on the instant and cumulative, that is per day, volt hours of electricity generated at home. I'll look out at the sky on a day like today and say, gee, you know, I think if I'm lucky out of a 2 kilowatt system or 2000 watt system, I'm lucky to maybe make 3 or 4 kilowatt hours today. On a really good day, I could make maybe 10 kilowatt hours. So what could I do with that? Well, I could drive about 40 miles on that in my electric vehicle, and I could fly, because it's so efficient, about 60 miles in my electric airplane. And that would be fine, but I deeply regret our grid dependence. I can't take that energy from the garage roof and put it directly into my electric vehicles. It has to go into the grid, unless I'm totally off the grid, which would be quite difficult to do. And so I feel that our grid is filthy. We're one of the worst states in the union, not the very worst, fortunately, but 75% of our electricity comes from burning coal and gas. We should have begun to fix this 2 decades ago, and I feel that strongly that we put the cart before the horse, if you'll pardon the pun, because we have the electric vehicles now starting to come on board, but we haven't fixed the grid to fuel it. And so I think it's a big problem that, and we're going to need more than just the so-called renewable forms of energy. Renewables, as I'm going to talk in my further slides, are good, but they won't do the job. We really need the strength of nuclear power. And so that will be the substance of my talk. Tom, you have the floor.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to share my screen here, and hopefully this works. I think Richard and I agree on the following: that the world must have a much better, low-cost, zero-carbon emission electricity generation alternative to meet, not only the US's but the world's urgent needs for electricity. And those alternatives need to be available now. The threat of climate change, the impact of climate change is something that we are now experiencing, and it will only get worse from here. The difference between Richard and I think, are an overly optimistic view of the potential of nuclear energy that becomes overly optimistic when it runs up against the unfortunate reality of the costs of nuclear energy and the unfortunate reality of how long it takes to build a nuclear plant. So let me advance slides. So this is a picture of Richard's not Richard's. Richard works with a group called Rethinking Nuclear. This is a picture of their website, and I want to draw your attention to the part in blue where it says we need nuclear power to avoid catastrophic climate change. And then under the frequently asked questions part of it, the sixth question there highlighted in blue, the acknowledgement that nuclear power is expensive. Fact, when nuclear power is not hampered by unfair market forces, we can make a lot of energy quite cheaply. So I'm going to challenge that and say, I think this is an example of falling in love with the science while ignoring the hard facts of cost. The title on that first page, so instead of "we need nuclear power to avoid catastrophic climate change," my recommendation, or a more accurate way of portraying this, would be climate change demands a coherent plan for getting to zero carbon. And then, the website goes on to say we cannot get all the electricity we need from renewables. I agree, but I'd argue that that's the wrong question. In this case, instead of saying that we can't get all of the energy that we need from renewables, I think the better statement would be, can we get all of the electricity that we need from efficiency, from renewables, and from storage? So I'll cut to the conclusion. At its current average global capital costs, nuclear power is not sufficiently attractive to facilitate market-driven deployment and cannot present an alternative to renewable energy production during the time we have left to act, at least according to the most recent IPCC report, which came out just recently. To pretend otherwise would result in the misdirection and the inefficient use of the limited funds that are available to transition our energy system. Let me go to this one. According to Amory Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute, new nuclear plants cost between 3 and 8 times or between 5 and 13 times, depending upon the study, more per kilowatt hour than unsubsidized new solar or wind power without subsidies. The most recent evidence that we have, the only nuclear plant that has been built in the US in the last 30 years is in Georgia. It's called the Vogtle plant. It's $16 billion over budget and 6 years late. The plants, they will have a 3 and 4, they'll have 2 units. They will have cost over $30 billion to have completed when they're finished. Vogtle 3 has had fuel loaded in late 2022 and is slated to start generating electricity soon, and that soon is 6 years late. Vogtle 4 may not start until 2024. Finally, I hope that we can all agree that business should work with government, and it shouldn't just be government that funds the transition of the energy grid. And if we agree that business should play a role in that, then we have to look at business's interest in participating in building that transitional grid. That's the Vogtle 3 and 4. There's an article, this is from an investment house that argues that public perception about nuclear has not been improving. Public concerns about nuclear power increase after each successive nuclear tragedy, from 3 Mile Island to Chernobyl to Fukushima. And that public concern reflects what we perceive to be a widespread negativity in many investors' minds toward nuclear power. In addition, the time to build nuclear power plants is 14.5 years from a submission of original design to construction. And that's simply time that we just don't have. The time to build a 560 megawatt solar farm is 4.5 months. So with that, I'm going to launch into an overall the overall presentation. So we both did an introduction. I'm going to take 20 minutes to build out some of those points that I just made, and then turn it over to Richard to do his own 20-minute presentation. So some of you may remember this. In 1957, Disney produced a film called Our Friend the Atom, which promoted nuclear power as power that would be too cheap to meter. The nuclear industry, since that time, has disappointed investors, ratepayers, and utilities ever since. Going back to the Amory Lovins article, new plants cost 3 to 8 times, according to an international bank study, or 5 to 13 times, according to a study of 24,000 actual nuclear power projects, more per kilowatt hour than unsubsidized new solar or wind power. Let me give you some examples of the current costs of nuclear. In 2012, South Carolina Electric and Gas started construction of 2 reactors that would generate 2,000 megawatts. Electricity bills jumped 18% to pay for that construction. In 2018, so 6 years later, after sinking $9 billion into the project was way behind schedule, only 40% complete, and the utility walked away with the loss. In Finland, construction of a new reactor at the Olkiluoto power plant is 8 years behind schedule and 6.5 billion over budget. In the UK and Wales, the Hitachi abandoned construction of the Wilpha nuclear plant and wrote off nearly $3 billion. The main company that was responsible for bidding on new nuclear plant construction was Westinghouse Electric. They had agreed to build both that South Carolina plant that I mentioned and the Georgia plant that I mentioned, the Vogtle plant. And in 2017, so they had agreed to build both of those plants on fixed price contracts. So they had bid on, you know, how much they were going to receive. For that amount, they were going to produce these reactors. They went bankrupt in 2017 because they couldn't do. There were so many cost overruns and it was taking so long. They declared bankruptcy. So Westinghouse Electric is no longer a player in the nuclear industry. At that point, both of the South Carolina and the Georgia projects were $14 billion over budget, and they just couldn't withstand that. So this is an update. So as recently as March 6th, from Vogtle 3, they have started the process. Let me just back up. So Vogtle 3 in 2017, when Westinghouse went bankrupt, they were $4 billion over budget. And it's a good thing Westinghouse got out when they did, because it will have cost an additional $25 billion by the time that Vogtle 3 and 4 are fully up and running. So that's a lot of money. Nonetheless, many of the most influential U.S. energy companies, such as the biggest power and electric utilities, say the U.S. must require emerging technologies like advanced nuclear. And I would ask you, who would benefit most from technologies that are as complicated and dangerous that they must be managed by experts? Before I turn to the role of the private sector in financing new nuclear, there's an article yesterday regarding Biden's budget proposal. For the first time since taking office, Biden has cut funding for nuclear energy in his budget request. And according to the article, the nuclear industry has benefited from a fire hose of federal spending in recently passed laws, but depends heavily on long-term government support to reverse decades of decline. In that same article, Craig Piercy, who's the chief executive of the American Nuclear Society, goes on to say, the general impression in the nuclear community is that the federal government is going to need to invest significantly more than what it's proposing over the next few years in order to help solve the challenges ahead. We're talking about amounts that start with a B, not an M. Perhaps there's an outcry for public funding for government support of nuclear because private funding for nuclear doesn't exist. Why would the private sector, which can sniff the possibility of profits better than a drug dog in an airport, shy away from investing in nuclear? The first reason is that interest and openness to investing in nuclear is impacted by public perception. And as I mentioned in my introduction, public perception is not positive towards nuclear, driven largely by very high publicity events. Public perception reflects what we perceive to be widespread negativity in many investors' minds, according to that investment article. Add on to this that it's seen as old world technology, even though I'm sure that Richard will talk about small modular reactors coming up. The general perception among the investment community is that nuclear technology is old world technology. Let me add to this and just look at just how has investments in nuclear done. So there are two exchange traded funds, and these are basically mutual funds, but that trade on a day-to-day basis. So it's a package of companies that are in the supply chain in the nuclear industry. The first one I'll mention is the Van Eck Uranium Nuclear Energy ETF. It trades under the symbol NLR, and it's down 2% year to date, down 3% over 1 year, and up 10% over the last 5 years. Not 10% per year, but up a total of 10% over the last 5 years. The other one is the Global X Uranium ETF, which focuses more on the fuel and uranium side of things, trades under the symbol URA, and that's down 4% year to date, 28% over the last year, and is up 53% over the last 5 years. In addition, Wall Street investors have moved on to wind, to solar, to batteries and efficiency, and are providing, and these technologies and these approaches, they're providing to be very resilient and low cost and present a path to a carbon-free future. And they've been a really good investment. Nuclear proponents, including Bill Gates, pin their hopes on new nuclear technology, but big barriers remain in the way of this nuclear renaissance. It takes years to test prototypes and get approval from federal regulators before a company can even start construction. One estimate is that it could take advanced nuclear projects 30 years to get through the regulatory review. That's a time frame beyond the interest of almost all investors. So no one has that sort of patience. Small modular reactors are still in development, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has received over 70 different proposals for small modular reactor designs. It will be years, verging on decades, before SMRs, small modular reactors, could contribute towards the energy mix. The other argument of pro-nuclear advocates is that the subsidies provided to the solar and wind sector have distorted the market so that nuclear can't compete. However, the truth is that the federal government has supported the nuclear industry for the last 70 years. Government has been a big supporter of research, of development and demonstration plants. Government takes on itself the cost of enriching uranium to make it usable in commercial nuclear power plants. Government provides stimulation of domestic uranium mining, provides incentives. Government has taken on the role of arranging for the long-term storage of nuclear waste. And then finally, government stepped in when the insurance industry wouldn't step in and has indemnified power plants and others in the industry against nuclear accidents. So providing the insurance for the industry, the private insurance industry stepped away and said they would not do this. And so the government had to step in there also. All right, so the cost of nuclear waste, and we may or may not talk more about this, is primarily borne by the US government and continues to be kicked down the road. In addition, critics allege that the most important subsidies to the nuclear industry have not involved cash payments, but rather the shifting of construction costs and operating costs from investors to taxpayers and ratepayers, burdening them with an array of risks, including cost overruns, defaults, and the management of nuclear waste. Though the president's budget reduces support for nuclear, government support for the nuclear industry was on display in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, which contains several provisions to help improve the competitiveness of nuclear power, incentivizing investments in new facilities and upgrades and maintaining existing plants to keep them operating at peak efficiency over the coming decades. The IRA's new production tax credits provided up to $15 per megawatt hour in subsidies through 2032 to help existing and aging nuclear plants remain competitive with other more technology up-to-date electricity generators. Additionally, the bill offers a tax credit equivalent to 30% of the capital costs of constructing new nuclear plants to help incentivize new nuclear infrastructure. In addition to the money provided by the government in the IRA, there was also $6 billion dubbed the Civilian Nuclear Credit Program in the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So now that money, that $6 billion, a good bit of it was, there was 1.1 million that was to be used for updating and fixing Pacific Gas and Electric's Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. However, that plant was the subject of a settlement in 2016 where PG&E agreed to shutter the plant by 2025. And then in contravention of that settlement, PG&E is now applying to the federal government for that $1.1 billion. This is facilitated through Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm, who was the former governor of Michigan. And she's now lobbying DOE also to bail out a nuclear plant in Michigan, the shuttered Palisades power plant on the shores of Lake Michigan. So because there's limited money, I mean, we're talking billions of dollars, but yes, I mean, it's not infinite. So there's limited money for energy investments. I'd argue it should be directed where it yields the greatest benefit. That is energy efficiency, wind, solar, and storage. By taking money from where it produces greater benefit, wind, solar, energy storage, efficiency, and putting it into the support of the nuclear industry, we actually increase carbon in the world. With costs of wind and solar declining, they continue to be the dominant new sources of power generation. Unlike wind and solar, whose costs continue to decrease, nuclear energy's costs continue to increase. And at the same time, most forecasters studying renewables have been positively surprised year after year as installation rates and cost reductions have exceeded expectations. They continue to get cheaper. In addition, renewables and efficiency provide about 5 times as many jobs per dollar invested as nuclear power, and they don't impose future costs and risks on taxpayers. So energy efficiency has delivered far more CO2 reduction than any alternative. Efficiency has led to the halving of demand over the last 30 years, and experts predict that efficiency can reduce demand by half again by 2050. And now I want to return to whether we have the time to include nuclear in the energy mix. I mentioned briefly the experience around the world and how long it takes to build a nuclear reactor. These are not isolated examples, as the average time to build a nuclear power plant is 14.5 years from the planning phase all the way to operation. We don't have 14.5 years to start reducing the amount of carbon that's being produced as we generate energy. In addition, a number of nuclear plants are at risk of closing prematurely due to their inability to compete in a wholesale electricity market. The Nuclear Energy Institute has warned that another 15 to 20 reactors are facing an imminent shutdown because they are not cost competitive in the market. They are not cost competitive. So we're not talking about any other reasons. Finally, to those critics that argue the nuclear industry is overregulated and that nuclear power is safe, and I'll say that quote unquote safe, I would pose the question of whether the assertion of safety of the industry isn't a reflection of the regulation of the industry. Have we created, in fact, a safe industry because it has been regulated as it has? I'm very concerned with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's proposed regulatory changes, which would accelerate the regulatory capture or more appropriate regulatory replacement of NRC's expert staffs. These experts are currently responsible for prescriptive standards, rigorous quality control, and verified technical performance. And instead, the regulatory change would delegate to industry experts who propose changes based on unconfirmed assertions, proprietary data, and subjective risk assessments. It's a story that's happening a lot, but I think it becomes even more concerning with this industry. So in listening to Rich's presentation, I urge you to return to the question of how much will this cost, how long will it realistically take, and who's going to be overseeing the industry. Richard, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Tom. You've primed my guns. I'm looking forward to offering a different viewpoints. Let me just get my system working here. Okay. So I will address each one of these things. One of the first things I'm going to address, though, is the idea of so-called idea of waste. This is brought up here in these casks, and I have a little joke at the beginning. When will cask hugging become a national sport? You see two people here hamming it up for the photographer, but these drums made of steel and concrete have safely stored what I don't like to call waste, but rather slightly used nuclear fuel. At power plants across the United States, they're ready for future development of advanced reactors. So we have the fuel practically already there. It's been enriched. It's been de-enriched by use for a couple of years, and it can relatively easily be enriched again if we close the cycle and recycle the fuel that way instead of having to mine it. It could be a very useful source of fuel and could reduce our costs considerably. Rigorously tested prior to use, these casks have not leaked or injured anyone. And this is a map of the licensed and operating independent spent fuel storage installations by site. And you can see the 36 of the states there that are in blue-gray have at least one storage site. Some of them are at existing nuclear plants and on a general license, and those are the ones that are darker orange. And the ones that are in a lighter orange with a little triangle are some of the state-specific licenses that might have to do with stored fuel and that sort of thing. But it shows you that Bernie Sanders, who during his debates for the Democratic Party presidential candidate, all he could say when university students asked him about nuclear was, "Oh, gee, it's an awful lot of waste." It isn't waste, it's slightly used, safely stored fuel. No one has ever been harmed by it. So I will start off with that one, although you didn't make that point, Tom. Some people do, particularly uneducated politicians. Coming a little bit to how are we doing as a nation? This is from the Energy Information Administration, these data, and they've looked back 20 some odd years from now, and they're projecting into the future as we go to the right in the shaded area. And you can see that our energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, and this was calculated projections this year, they've come up with a high economic growth rate, high economic growth if we try to go to zero carbon technology costs. And if we, in other words, if we change our point of view and accept and try hard to have a low economic growth, it could be this way, but the reference case in between the two suggests that after 2030, we're not going to get very far. And we're certainly not doing very well up till now, but they're predicting things will plateau after 2030 rather than getting better. And so I think we need to do something more than what we've been accomplishing in the past while, which has been pretty pathetic. The question that the World Bank raises to deal with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they say we need to work fast. We just got the report a few days ago, and they warn that only nuclear power can be deployed quickly enough. And that's reaching out to your point, Tom, about speed. If you look at the countries that have depended primarily on wind, solar, geothermal, and biofuels, and these are not countries that necessarily did that, but if you just take those sources of electricity and energy, but particularly electricity, on a per person and year basis, none of them have come close, not a country, in terms of their development of these energies to reaching a point, 300 here on this generation of electricity in kilowatt hours per person per year, which is going to be required to limit our temperature increase to 2 degrees. Whereas with nuclear, several countries have succeeded: Sweden, France, Finland, and Belgium. We haven't succeeded yet in this country, but looking globally, it can be done. And it can be done relatively rapidly. This has been in part of a letter that Alex Canara from Stanford, an electrical engineer emeritus there, sent in a letter to the president. And I was happy to be included as a co-author in that letter. I think that Alex is doing a great job in trying to make the president see the need for nuclear power. It is important because it's compact. The pellet size of its fuel, about 1 centimeter in diameter and about 1 centimeter high, giving about 20 grams. And that's in other words, about 7/10 of an ounce. And that's equivalent to 400 kilograms of coal. It's a really remarkable difference. And if you look at the land required to produce more energy per square foot, nuclear is barely visible. It's a tiny, tiny little blue dot there, and coal is here, hydro, solar, and look at wind and biomass. Dreadful amount of space required. So that's one thing. It's not only compact, but the massive materials needed to generate a terawatt hour are very high for these renewables. Solar is the worst of them all. Hydro uses a lot of concrete. Here we're having cement, some concrete, some glass, a lot of steel, and then other for solar. And hydro, of course, mostly concrete, a lot for wind for the bases of it, and so on. But you get down here to nuclear, and we're right down with the unfortunate, horrible fossil fuels. But wind is 11 times as much construction material needed, and solar 18 times more. This has been ignored he's only talked about, Tom, about the cost, but the cost is largely for federal support, which he hasn't, I don't think, dealt with adequately. So here with fission, we have energy that's clean, it's produced 24/7, and it has produced more carbon-free sources than all the other carbon-free sources combined. Our 93 reactors generate nearly 19% of our total electricity, and they operate 90% of their capacity. So nuclear adds diversity, reliable power to our grid in any weather, and gives us crucial energy security. These two fellows, Jesse Jenkins and Samuel Thurston, are pioneers. This fellow is an assistant professor at let me look here. At Princeton University, sorry about that. And Sam Thurston is a founder and executive director of the Energy Innovation Reform Project. These are pioneers in the field, and they say very clearly in the New York Times opinion, we need more than solar and wind to power the Green New Deal. I recommend their readings to you. Nuclear Matters is an organization, a private one that looks to support outstanding bring to people's awareness the outstanding year for fission that this has been this past year of 2022. They feel that it's an anticipated nuclear energy renaissance and has surpassed our expectations. The Inflation Reduction Act that Tom correctly referred to provided crucial support for maintaining our current fleet of light water reactors. He's right. It is a 70-year-old technology. It's been badly treated by our politicians and many of our government regulators. And we do need to build newer, smaller, and less expensive small modular reactors, which when factory built, can be more quickly assembled on sites. We can put them directly into existing coal plant sites where they can be hooked up to the electric generators and power lines. The COP27 meeting for the first time this year had enthusiastically supported nuclear. Catherine Huff, the Deputy Director of Energy, states that it would be more costly and more dangerous not to utilize nuclear fission as we build a greener future. President Biden's policy has been, I think, one of the most important bills passed by this country, if not, some people say the most important. The federal agencies and the International Energy Agency claim that our national carbon mitigation targets can only be achieved by doubling our nuclear power capacity by 2050. There's no free lunch for any energy source. Most people think that solar power is free once you own or rent the panels. Well, yes, but a lot of minerals, electricity, and heat were required to make them. The UN reports that only 20% of the PV waste is recycled, while 80% goes to landfills or gets shipped to developing countries. China's refused to take them, so we may have to get like Europe and think about a proper way to recycle them. To the best of my knowledge, it's only a few ideas yet. My solar panels are going to need recycling in about 5 years, and I have no idea where I'm going to send them yet. But I can tell you that in another 15 years, there are going to be a lot of them going for recycling. They only last about 20 years, and their capacity factor is so much lower than nuclear. So I think to say that it takes a little while to build them and it's a little expensive to build them, we need to look at other factors that shows their importance. What did sun and wind do for California? Well, this is a carbon intensity over 11 years in California, and it's the intensity of electricity consumption. And as you know, over those 11 years, California has put up a lot of solar panels on a lot of wind turbines. Look at this, the median here, but look at the huge variation in day-to-day consumption of energy as people have used more and more wind turbines and solar panels. And when the sun goes under and the wind stops blowing, we have to bring out gas. And my son is working to keep some of these gas plants working across California. He works for General Electric, and he's been very busy these past 10 years or so because they're using to fill in for the closed nuclear plants in California. Fission plants, yes, do cost more to build. There's no denying that. You can look at this piece of information here. Nuclear is right up there. This is the high estimate, and the lower estimates are in blue. Most planners, though, only think about the upfront cost, or sometimes they include the levelized or operating cost, but few of them include the back capacity factor, the cost of gas backup, the batteries. They're expensive, I can tell you. Their lifespan, about 20 years compared with 80 or more for nuclear. And so on the next slide, we'll see an organization in Finland called Thoughtscapism, and they have taken the initiative to compare nuclear in Korea, Finland, with wind offshore, onshore, wind offshore, and solar in Germany. They've looked at the capital cost, and sure, nuclear is pretty high if you just look at the capital cost in pounds per gigawatt of electricity. But if you take into account the capacity factor, and we're running 90 to 95% capacity factor, that is, we're actually consuming and utilizing what the capacity of the equipment is that's installed, whereas with wind onshore only 25%, 40%, a bit more for offshore, and not so much for solar in Germany, at least. But look at the lifetime of these. These are pretty conservative estimates. We're finding this was probably going to be elevated to 80 years or more, whereas these limitations here are significant. And that hasn't been discussed at all in Tom's economic considerations. When you factor all these in, the capital cents, the capital in cents per kilowatt hour is lower for both these nuclear countries, South Korea and Finland, than for these other sites. I'm not sure what countries were included here. But I think it's an important that we do need to consider the durability as well as the capacity factor in coming up with fair estimates of relative cost. Also, back when a lot of this data were generated, the cost of gas to use to back up intermittent solar and wind was only 28 cents per therm. Look at it, it's triple the cost today after only 2 more years. And so it's known that the price of the backup fuel is highly volatile, and on a per molecule basis, methane, which is in most of our natural gas, is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is in terms of containing the solar energy that comes through the clouds and keeping it from coming back and being radiated out into space. And so that's a serious problem. And when it does oxidize, even though it lasts only decades, it oxidizes into carbon dioxide, which is around for centuries. Now, I have to agree with Tom on his discussions of Vogtle. There's no doubt that the costs have increased considerably. These particular numbers might not jibe exactly with Tom's, but these were the initial projections and the latest projections and the cost in the years overrun. This has happened in France as well and in Finland. But I can look at other places. I have to agree that we've made some serious mistakes in this country and also in Europe. But I'd like to just show you what the construction times have been to connect to the grid. Many times, way back in the early days of nuclear plant construction, this was within 5 or so years. And this happened quite a little while until we got up to around 1970 or so, and then it started going up. I think as the NRC began to think up some more safety rules and added unnecessarily to our costs. The safety rules that Tom feels are being short-circuited, I don't agree with. I think that they're based upon the concept of no threshold, which have been proven by many people to be false, so that we're requiring 10 to 100-fold greater reduction of radiation in terms of causing risk to people far below the background radiation levels that we all get from radon in our homes and going to get a CAT scan. So I think that we've seriously overdone the costs of nuclear because of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So Tom and I are agreed on that, but that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is doing a bad job. I think he wants it to get worse and I want it to get better. So we'll see. Also, we don't have to just look at ourselves in the past. Look at what's been going on in France for, this is in months here. So 60 means year, 5 years. And they've been doing very well for decades. Only started to creep up more lately. Some of these are experimental reactors in the that don't really quite count as in the cost matrix. Japan has done even better. Other than their 1 Gen 4 material, all of their standard light water reactors were built in less than 5 years. They plan to build 150 more plants over the next 10 years. And here is the country that dealt with Fukushima. Fukushima, by the way, was not a nuclear disaster. It was a tsunami disaster. Nobody died, with possibly one exception. Somebody got a bit of thyroid cancer, which is generally quite treatable. And if they dispensed iodine in Japan, they probably wouldn't have had that mortality. but their mortality in Japan was from suicides of people who were not allowed to go back to their homes, and from the tsunami itself. But it was not a nuclear disaster. It was a tsunami disaster. In Germany and a number of other countries, for some reason or other, seem to think that they're going to have a tsunami there. I can't imagine a tsunami affecting Germany, and yet they decided right after that deadly disaster in Japan to shut down their nuclear reactors. Really bizarre logic in my mind. South Korea is another country that has a robust nuclear industry. It has the most successful nuclear program in the free world. Their costs are running to about $2,000 per kilowatt from two of their centers. The current administration, things slowed down for a while under President Moon, but the current administration hopes to restore things, although the Koreans are a bit obsessing over tritium releases. Tritium in water is about as harmless as you could get in terms of something with radioactivity. When you put tritium, combine it with oxygen to make tritiated water, I would be quite happy to drink a glass of tritiated water. I think the concern people have over tritium is just outrageously wrong. And we have to understand that fission, is used for more than just electricity. Look at all these countries in Eastern Europe and across Asia that are using it for district heating, process heating, and desalination. Most of them are in Eastern Russia, Eastern Europe, and in Asia. So we've been thinking purely of electricity. We're going to be needing heat in the not too distant future for making clean hydrogen, for making steel and other products in order to reduce the tremendous emissions from industry. And we can be using the heat that nuclear has to offer. It's never even come up in the conversation. Well, let's look back a little bit at two neighboring powerhouses in Europe. We have Germany on the left here, and this was taken just a year ago and a little bit on a given day from you can look up this website. It's called electricitymap.org. And these numbers were taken from their website, showing the carbon intensity in carbon dioxide equivalents per kilowatt hour. And it's 5 times in Germany what it is in France, because they're not using, they only have one nuclear plant, I think, left, 1 or 2. And look at all the coal they're burning in the brown here. Whereas in France, all this nuclear is being used and very little coal. So that's the reason. And also the cost in Germany is 1.5 times greater than in France. And so then they decided, a group in Chalmers University in Sweden looked at every day, and they looked at the hour of the day, plotted it by hour over 10 years, over 1 year, I'm sorry, from summer of 2020 to summer of 2021. And consistently, Germany had a much higher carbon intensity in terms of grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour compared to France. So we're more like Germany. If you look at what we've been doing over the past 20 years, here's the United States in red, here's Germany in black. And yeah, we've been coming down a bit to about 1/3, or in some cases a little bit more in Germany, but we're not doing all that well. Whereas France has been not just getting better, it's been better for a long time because they built their nuclear plants decades ago and continue to use them. 78% of their grid comes from nuclear power plants. Now, there are other countries in Europe that have also embraced nuclear enthusiastically. This is Slovenia, for example, but I'm afraid only 13 of 27 countries in Europe are pro-nuclear. And if you look at the population in Slovakia, 60% of the people are keen, but if you go to Austria, 70% are opposed. I have a friend in Germany who has forest there as a business, and I've asked him, why is the Green Party there so powerful? And he says, it's something stronger even than any religious zealotry that he can imagine, that the Green Party just says no, no, no to nuclear without giving it any serious consideration. Let's look back in history a wee bit to the Sierra Club and look at David Siri, who was the director and founder back in 1966, one of the founders. The Sierra Club split about 50-50 into whether they were for or against nuclear power, and it fractured apart, and the anti-nuclear people won out. My thesis today is that people who advocate for 100% renewables harm our planet more than climate deniers do. I feel that strongly about it. I know cost is a problem. I'll agree with that. But what is our planet worth? What are we as a species worth? I don't think we can put a value to it just because the market favors short-term thinking of solar and wind, particularly when you ignore the capacity factor, when you ignore the intermittency, when you ignore the durability. Solar can look pretty good. There's a guy called Jack Devaney who is a nuclear enthusiast, but he's very concerned about the history of nuclear in this country. He said he agrees with Greta Thunberg. He says it's true, if we only have 20 or 30 years to drastically cut our carbon dioxide emissions, then we're not going to make it, and we will impoverish and kill billions trying. As Greta points out, all we can do is panic. Jack would like to think that maybe a gradual reduction in CO2 emissions over the next 100 years will suffice. And then if we can avoid our usual stupidities, there is a chance we can pull it off. I can't say that I agree with Jack, but I propose that we need to keep all our options open, and to just reject nuclear, I think, is a serious mistake. Jack goes on to say the enemy is us. He says it has everything going for it. It's dispatchable, incredible density, tiny amount of waste, tiny amount of land, no pollution, etc. What went wrong? He says it wasn't the sinister machinations of big oil. It wasn't the bumbling electricity contractors. It wasn't the misanthropic anti-nukes, although I think that was partly it. But he says the problem lies within. Nuclear power never escaped from its government-sponsored and controlled birth. We set up an unlimited regulatory apparatus, meaning the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, from which there is no appeal, a bureaucracy which ignores the benefit of nuclear power while focusing only on the potential hazards and its own survival, a tribunal whose only rule is that we set the rules, we, NRC, and we can change them and charge millions of dollars just to look at anybody's application. It's outrageous, the way that they have blocked us. And if you look at 8 places on Earth where we have succeeded with large nuclear grids, electrical grids, it's France, Ontario, Sweden, and Switzerland that have a good amount of nuclear. Now, hydro has been a good friend as well. And particularly in Quebec, where Niagara Falls is a natural waterfall, you can just take the energy directly out of the river without melting a dam. But in Sweden, Norway, British Columbia, Paraguay, Switzerland, they've also done very well with hydro as well as nuclear. But the point is, they've done it. And I think we have to recognize the history and the value that nuclear has had in the past. Tom kindly put up our website, and we have an action group within the website because nuclear, it seems to have a hard time getting around people's tongues. People keep calling it nuclear, and so it has a negative connotation. We have people like Mitch McConnell saying the nuclear alternative. It really sounds like a bad name. And so we've chosen the word fission because we're an action group. We live in the States in the Midwest, and our goal is to help others appreciate the potential value of fission power as the most effective way to reduce carbon emissions in our atmosphere. So we're open to some rebuttal comments from you, Tom.
So I have you as doing the first rebuttal. Would you like me to take the first rebuttal, or what? How would you like to proceed?
Oh, thank you. I will go ahead. Maybe since we have it that way, let me go back on and share my slides again. Let's see, how can I do this? Okay, I will do that and then come back on again. Thank you, Tom. I forgot about that. Now we have Microsoft.
This is the 5-minute rebuttal, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
I'm having some difficulty finding my other slideshow. Let me just take a minute or two to try and do that. Okay. Shut that one down. And save it. Here we are. Thank you. I wanted to touch base on the federal energy related tax incentives. Tom mentioned that nuclear gets a huge amount of support. In this diagram by Robert Bryce, well-known energy expert known across the country, done a lot of research and publications. He points out that ITC solar, PTC wind, and hydrocarbons, but particularly wind and solar, have had vast amounts of federal support in terms of related tax incentives. Hydrocarbons less actually, and nuclear a tiny fraction. So that's one of the, I don't know which of these, I've not done the calculations, but I'm just putting up Robert Bryce as a well-known energy expert to point out that we haven't had all that much. Yes, we've had insurance because just like federal bank insurance, we do need something to deal with the catastrophic results that Chernobyl had, although we've certainly not had any big problems in this country since nuclear began. The other thing relates a bit to the waste. I know we haven't talked about waste very much, but you can see that it is this is a tiny fraction compared with electronic waste, medical waste, hydrocarbon waste, municipal waste, construction waste, agricultural waste, and industrial waste. So we seem to have focused so much on the waste. There's another way to look at the used nuclear fuel anatomy. This is a typical nuclear pellet of uranium oxide that has been enriched to 3% of the lighter isotope that is fissile. And after 2 years, when that pellet has been removed, it goes from 97% uranium-235 to 95%. And it makes a tiny bit of plutonium, a little bit of uranium-235, and some fission products that decay in about 300 years. And so it's not nearly as bad as people make it out to be. It could easily be recycled if we took the trouble and time to do it. Most other countries do. For example, France, England, Japan, and other countries have taken a different route than the open cycle, where we just don't bother to do anything about it and leave it lying around in casks. This spent nuclear fuel, as they call it, is really only slightly used rather than spent. It's a valuable asset, not a waste requiring disposal. France offers reprocessing services to several countries here, and the non-recyclable part of the radioactive waste is eventually sent back to the user nation. But this is in La Hague, in France. United States, unfortunately, took the low road and suffered. This is something about attitudes that people have. We've touched on this. Men seem to prefer, when asked who's in favor of nuclear fission, highly in favor or slightly in favor. And men outnumber women, probably because they have perhaps a little more engineering experience, although that's going to change because women are entering the field rapidly. Not sure why the gender difference. I'm a bit surprised at the age lack of difference. The people I've talked to who are younger, I talk to me, perhaps they defer to my age, but they say they're quite enthusiastic, but that's of course not a major number. College education surprises me again that there's not a little more difference. But what I find shocking and rather sad is this last group. If they look at people who worry a great deal about climate change, 34% of them only are in favor of nuclear. If you just worry a fair amount about it, about half are favor nuclear. If you worry a little or not at all, oh yeah, most of the people say, sure, nuclear is fine. That tells me that there's a huge amount of prejudice out there among the climate change organizations, and that people are accepting this information without seriously learning about it. So what can we still do? Well, we need to strongly promote all clean energy. Stopping climate change is not as easy as many organizations seem to believe. Perhaps they don't understand the scale of the problem. Everyone should try to be an environmentalist. You should rethink your prejudices and your priorities. Pro-nuclear and pro-renewable people should join forces, not fight each other, to tackle the climate problem. We're not asking people to stop voicing their opinions. We ask for a prudent use of limited resources. But what can you do as an individual? You can keep your aim on the goal, halting the emissions and not the tool, focusing on the antagonism between renewables versus nuclear. If you look at these four horses of disaster here, and they're labeled war, famine, pestilence, and death. And the last guy, death, says, and you are? He looks over at the fifth horse, misinformation. Share this idea with friends and family. Ask hard questions about new tools, and don't limit your options arbitrarily. Include nuclear power. It's essential, in my opinion, for mitigating climate change. Finally, we come back to our old friend Jack Delaney, who says, I think I read this, so we'll skip on that one. And we'll go to this one. On a more positive note, nuclear, as solar is going to bed, says, don't worry, I got you. And I think that these two sources, particularly rooftop solar, as opposed to covering vast areas of land, is a good idea. There are some trees growing, and we need to keep the trees pruned, not only for keeping the power lines safe in ice storms, but for allowing more and more people to have solar panels on the rooftops. It's a great way to educate the public and let them realize that leaving lights on at night is fine, but better to have a motion detector so that the lights only come on if somebody is moving around that you don't expect at night. And I have a remarkable number of people living where I do in Applewood Hill who leave their nighttime lights on all day long. I almost want to go in and knock on the door and say, since you bought this new house, did they ever tell you where the light switch is so you can shut them off in the daytime? People, I think, become more aware of energy when they have solar panels on their roof and in general. And I think we all need to be aware of that. It's a multidisciplinary problem. Maybe I've gone a little over my 5, but thanks, Tom. It's your turn.
All right, I don't have another PowerPoint to share, but so I think we are in agreement that the old nuclear technology is not what you're envisioning or we're envisioning for the future, that there is a new nuclear time awaiting us, these small modular reactors, and so whatever is involved in that. So if we start with the presumption that yes, we're not talking about building any more Vogtle 3 and 4s that cost $25 billion and run 6 years over budget or 6 years late, and are just massive drains on both taxpayers and ratepayers and cause investors to go bankrupt. Then we're pinning our hopes on this new technology. The problem that I would assert with this new technology is, and I think I mentioned this in my presentation, we don't have a design yet. There are 70 proposals that are being currently entertained. Bill Gates has one. He was just in the news with his. He was dependent on Russia for the only place in the world that makes fuel for his new technology. And because of the war, that was a little problematic for Bill Gates. So, I mean, there's another 69 possible options out there. And I guess I would just be cautious and say, all right, we're approaching this as any entrepreneur would approach the development of a new business idea. And there's going to be starts and stops and successes and failures, and we're going to learn as we go along. The point I'm making is none of this happens quickly. That the IPCC came out just recently and said, we have even less time than what we thought. And so I'm fearful that the knee-jerk reaction of the nuclear crowd then is, all right, well, if we can't wait for the new nuclear, then let's sort of breathe life into the old nuclear, because that's a proven technology. It just costs a lot and takes a long time, but we know we can get this approved. Whereas with new nuclear, we don't even know if we're going to get it approved. We don't even have the design submitted yet for the approval. And my argument is we don't have the time. We can't wait for coalition or sort of agreement to happen around the one or two designs that have the best technology or the best ideas or the best backing. And so, sort of again, I'll quote Amory Lovins, the early small modular reactors will cost at least twice as much per kilowatt hour as existing reactors, which are already 3 to 13 times more than you would pay for renewables. And we already have SMRs, small modular solar panels and small modular solar that are up and running. So, maybe to sort of save some time, let me just encourage you to respond to the dilemma that we face. On one hand, we have old technology that we know works, but we can't afford, and we can't afford from a time or a cost perspective. And the new technology, which is unproven and unfit for prime time, I guess I would argue.
I appreciate that. I have to agree with you when you look at the cost overruns. That's really often. My reply to that is, we're thinking of the United States, but we've got a global problem. And I hate to admit it, but some non-democratic countries like Russia and China are way ahead of us. And we invented fission, not fission itself, but at least the chain reaction. And we have let it go. We have treated nuclear terribly badly. I think Jack Devaney makes some points that when you look back at the history of how nuclear has been treated, it's abominable. And I think that we do need to keep the Generation 2 reactors going. Let me answer another part of your question by explaining about the new generation of reactors, if I may. There are two kinds. There are the small modular reactors that are using the old technology of light water moderation. What they do is they minify, reduce the size, put them underground, and allow natural convection to change dissipate the heat and yet generate electricity. And by doing this, they get around the problem that they had in Japan and Fukushima when they lost the grid as a result of the tsunami. Their batteries would only last a few days. And so that's why we had the hydrogen explosions as it accumulated. So the small modular reactor is tremendously advanced over the old ones, even though it uses the old technology. It's advanced because you can manufacture them off-site, because you can bury them, because you can use natural temperature regulation rather than depend on the grid. And you do not have to have nearly as big an area around them to deal with in case of an explosion, because you're just not going to get an explosion when they're buried underground and they're small. The other thing is that you can put in, you can adapt them to the need. If you're talking about a community in an isolated place like an island that would otherwise be dependent on shipping in fuel, or some Arctic location or someplace in Alaska, you could have a small modular reactor and you could tailor the number of them. Since they run about 300 megawatts, as opposed to 1,000 or 2,000 megawatts, then you could say you could have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 and so on. So you can determine the size of the unit you want for the community that you're considering. Okay, that's the small modular reactor. Then you go to the kind that Bill Gates was talking about. That's not a small modular reactor, it's a fair size. And the other thing that you may not be aware of is that Bill Gates was involved in 2 reactors. The first one was the molten salt reactor. And that is a clever idea. It's one of 4 families of Generation 4 reactors. It doesn't use light water as opposed to heavy water. Light water is just the conventional water that we all drink and live with. And that's a pretty good moderator. But it uses molten salts. The uranium or thorium is melted into fluoride salts, either sodium or potassium salts. And so it's already a liquid. It cannot blow up, and it operates without pressure at 800 degrees. Whereas with water, if you get over 100 degrees, you have to pressurize it, and you have all that problem of pressurization. So there are all kinds of safety factors. You can't have meltdown. You can't have many of the problems that you have with pressurization. So what happened to Bill Gates? Well, his problem with China was only with the molten salt reactors. They were the ones we gave them, by the way, that technology. Oak Ridge just handed it to them because nobody in this country was interested. And so, in fact, 2 of our great leaders of the past, the shut down our breeder reactor out in Idaho. They were Democratic leaders, by the way. And that was unfortunate because they said, oh, we don't need it anymore because we didn't need the plutonium for making more bombs. So they just shut down the whole thing. And meanwhile, China went ahead with it. And now they can't work with Bill Gates. The other kind of reactor that Bill Gates is working with is called Natrium, Natrium. And the first 2 letters of natrium stand for the chemical formula for sodium. And so it's liquid sodium. Most of us don't think about sodium as a metal, but it can liquefy at a nice temperature of several hundred degrees and be a very good moderator and conducts the heat more effectively into electricity. So Bill Gates is working ahead with natrium, and I think successfully. So he hasn't been totally blocked by the problem with China. So that helps me to answer, I think, some of your questions.
So let's do a quick close, and then we've got a bunch of questions. We've got 6 questions coming in. So is there anything that you want to add in closing?
No, I think I've wrapped up pretty well. I want to emphasize my last slide. Did you see that one?
Yes.
Remember that one?
Yes.
It was where you're getting along. I tell you, there's an organization in California, I hesitate to name it, but it actually doesn't have a name, but there's an individual, Alex Canara, who you may not have heard of, but you might Google him. He has a mailing list of 100 followers. And I really respect him. He's got some great ideas, but I think that he is so anti-solar in his approach, so anti-renewable, that he risks getting the world who are watching us perhaps today and saying, if these guys are going to bicker among themselves, we're not going to get anywhere. I think even though I feel that solar has its limitations, I can see its value. I've got it on my roof. And so I like to see us get along and accept each other rather than bicker. And that's why I appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, Tom, today. That's Thanks. My final piece.
So I'll just say, in spite of Richard's plea for getting along, I'm just not in the camp that I don't think we have the time or the resources to breathe life into an industry whose time has passed. And there are certainly a lot of, sort of all of the above crowd that appeals or tries to appease every constituency and offend nobody, and argues that the government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners, picking and backing winners. And I'd remind us that the dean of the U.S. utility regulators, Peter Bradford, said, "No, we are not picking and backing winners as the government. They don't need it. We're picking and backing losers." So that's my concern with sort of the continual reliance on the government. Let me jump into some of these questions because we've got some good questions.
Good.
The first question came in just, Richard, you can talk to this far better than I can. Costs and risks of nuclear waste, and you've talked, I think, at length about that. Is there, so we understand the risk and you shared those. Is there anything that you can add on costs of nuclear waste?
Yes. I think that you can look at waste, nuclear waste, in two ways. One is that you have some states built into their regulations that they will not allow the construction of new nuclear plants unless a repository is made and is available. And most states refuse to have it within their states, which involves some transportation. That is going to be a problem. As long as those states have that, that's a problem. Illinois has it, for example, and yet 45% of Illinois' electricity comes from nuclear, and only 9 or 10% of ours comes from nuclear. Maybe 14 from one nuclear plant that's allowed. But fortunately, we got rid of the ban on new nuclear construction in Wisconsin. And I think we do need to deal with the fact that sooner or later, there's going to be some waste that you just can't deal with. We can get rid of most of it by using the Generation 4 reactors. At Oak Ridge, they had a particular reactor they called a waste burner. And this was a Gen 4 reactor, which built and ran perfectly well in Oak Ridge for years. They eventually shut it down because they didn't need it anymore. But they burned waste, and it generated a lot of electricity as they burned it. Not burned in the sense of oxidation, but burned in the sense of controlled fission. So that's one way of dealing with waste. The other way of dealing with waste is to accept and promote the fact that we will have Generation 4 reactors sooner than you think, possibly some as early as 2028. Canada and the United States are working together with several opportunities to develop Generation 4 reactors that may be operating within 3 or 4 years. I don't think we need to wait 30 years. Now, some people would say yes, to have the whole grid replaced with Generation 4 reactors. Sure, that will probably take 30 years, but especially if the Gen 1s Gen 2s can be maintained properly. But I think that so there are two ways of dealing with it. One is to have a repository, which we still need to work on. We're having a lot of problems with that. Nevada has shut down for political reasons only Yucca Mountain after it's been built. And that's a tragedy, a political tragedy. And that needs to be opened up, and we need to stop thinking about NIMBY and not in my backyard. And the other problem is to utilize the waste. It's fuel. And that fuel could be as early as a few years away. Let me add a tiny little thought to that, if I may. When we're all very aware these days of problems in Russia, but 30 years ago, when the USSR broke into its republics, they had some serious financial problems. The United States paid $70 billion for warheads that were stored in Russia and were about to be dismantled because of agreements to dismantle our nuclear weapon stocks. That $70 billion worth of highly enriched uranium fuel powered American reactors for at least 10, if not 15 to 20 years. I don't know the exact number. So, and that was a case where we took that, what would have otherwise been waste, into civilian use. It was a dramatic and wonderful thing. Most of the public is not aware of that. And I think it's another way to deal with waste. Not that we should, we're going to be dealing with Russia anytime soon, but we should be thinking ultimately of getting rid of these nuclear stockpiles. And if so, we have enough material there so we never have to mine any uranium at all. When it's enriched to the degree that it needs to be for a warhead, you've got all kinds of energy there under a controlled mechanism. So we can reduce our costs and reduce the waste problem by doing that sort of thing.
There's another question that you're going to be far better at answering than I am. So talk about thorium versus uranium as fuel, and whether the small modular reactors can use thorium as a fuel. How would that affect costs, safety, those kinds of things?
That's a great question. And I'm not in a position to go into a long talk on thorium, but you can, if that person would like to write to me at coot42, COOT42 @gmail.com. I would be glad to send them some of my talks on thorium, or at least some selected parts of it. But to try and answer the question as best I can in these few words, thorium is not soluble in water, as opposed to uranium, which is. And so people are very excited about the fact that thorium is about 3 or 4 times more of it on the planet's crust than there is uranium. People say, well, thorium is great because there's more of it around, and it's people don't ignore it, and it has great potential. But you could also say that we could eventually, if we took our minds to it, we could harvest uranium from seawater. And if we did that, there'd be enough uranium around to last until the planet is gone and we've melted into the sun. So the fuel is really quite renewable, if you want to think of it in those terms. But to get back to thorium, it has several remarkable advantages. It is not fissile, but it's fertile. In other words, if you mix it with a little bit of uranium that is fissile and it sends off neutrons, it can start thorium to change its character and convert into another isotope of uranium called not 238, which is in most of the rocks, not 235, which is in our reactors and our bombs, but 233. Now, uranium 233 goes down a totally different pathway, does not make nearly as much waste, about 1/5 the amount of waste, and it's just a great alternative to uranium. Why don't we use it, for goodness sakes? Because the world got used to working with thorium. We had built a whole industry. Within the uranium field, you have nuclear engineers and nuclear physicists. The nuclear physicists are the brains, the nuclear engineers are the brawn. And the brawn has sort of taken over. And you have a guy like Admiral Rickover, who was the brawn and didn't have much respect for the physicists. And so thorium got left behind, and it's really going to be hard to resurrect it. But one of the best ways to resurrect it is in a particular one of the Gen 4, the family of 6, is called a molten salt reactor. And in that one especially, although you can put them into even light water reactors, but thorium works very well in a molten salt reactor. And so I think that would be a great combination. That's a quickie answer.
Thank you. So we have a question about Wisconsin, which I think we should address. So in Wisconsin, I think you said that we produce about 14% of the state's electricity with nuclear. Question is there any momentum, political or otherwise, for expanding that? And isn't all the momentum in the other direction with nuclear plants running their course and shutting down?
That's depends on the way you look at it. If you're a positive person like me, I think there's potential. Let me tell you 2 ways in which there's potential. This particular plant at Point Beach is in northern part of northeast corner of Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. It has a stellar track record. Listening in on this panel, I think, is a man by the name of Stephen Shellen, who has worked there for 30 some odd years and is a member of our Friends of Fishing group. And he has been sending me pictures of this place. I'd like to go and visit it, but it has been getting close to 60 years. And they have an application in, and they expect it to be renewed for another 20. So that will give it a running room for 80 years. That's a testament to a well-built facility that is making, you can't, one plant making 14% of our energy and a huge amount of our clean energy. If you have it rather than our total electricity and just talk about our clean electricity, it's doing much better. And so the majority of our clean energy comes from that one plant. Now, there's another way to look at it. There's a place in La Crosse, and this place is the site of an earlier reactor, a place called Dairyland Power. And the CEO of that company, named of Brent Ridge, is a member of our Friends of Fishing group. And he's been talking with us and telling us that he would like to, he and some other utilities would like to purchase a small modular reactor from NuScale. NuScale is one of the many that you mentioned have been designed. NuScale has been approved now pretty much completely by the NRC. And so I'm optimistic that even though they undoubtedly be some escalation of costs as there are above these projections in any Gen 2 reactor, I think that this is a positive element. I would like to see this reactor be developed along the Mississippi River near La Crosse, and I wish Brent all success. And so that would be another site and could improve the situation for Wisconsin. I think that Madison is a very green city, and I have been to meetings of many green organizations, 350.org for one, but several others, Sierra Club and others. And I've asked them if they'd like to learn about nuclear energy. And they say, thank you, Richard, but we really don't want to learn any more about it. And so with that view in mind, I have some, that's the other side of my optimism, that Wisconsin and Madison in particular might not be the best place. But I have a little bit of ray of hope because we did reverse the ban on new nuclear construction. So that's a positive side. So I'm on both sides.
Yep, that's very true. We have a question comment, and I think both of us are going to agree with this. As we transition to a more dispersed generating, sort of environment where there are wind turbines in the middle of nowhere and solar arrays that often are in farm fields now. The challenge is how do we tie them into the grid? That the grid has developed around the big facilities, whether those were nuclear or coal or now natural gas, and figuring the cost of expanding the grid to places that it didn't need to expand into before should actually be counted in the costs of solar and or wind or other renewables. And does that then, argue in favor of nuclear or other more centralized kinds of generation? So I'll turn it over to you to comment on that to begin with, and then I'll offer a comment also.
Yes, I think that we have to look not only at the distance that the wires are running, where we lose anywhere from 7 to 10% or more of the electricity on the wires. So the longer they run, the more energy we lose and the more susceptible they are to violent storms, ice storms, etc. But we have to also think about the intermittency of some of the renewables. Hydro is great, but we don't have a very big gradient in Wisconsin. I don't know if you're aware of it, but where I keep my electric plane, it's up in Sauk City, and 32 megawatts of nice clean energy. I don't know what's coming into the grid, but it's just a mile away. I would imagine that a good bit of that gets into my airplane. I think that's nice. But so it's good that we have some hydro. I wish we had more. Unfortunately, we don't live near Niagara Falls, but so that's one aspect of proximity. But it's also what I like about hydro is that it's there. Solar, I'm very aware when I look at my solar panels, they don't start to kick up until 9 o'clock or so in the morning, and they really get going about 10, and they go from 10 to 2 and then slow down in the afternoon. If you look at you may have heard of the duckbill curve, where a lot of the electricity is needed at supper times. People come home, turn on their ovens and their television sets and their air conditioners, and that's just as the sun is going to bed. And so that's a problem for solar, and I think that's where nuclear helps out. We can certainly get some energy from hydro if it's handy, but to build more gas plants is a tragedy because these things are going to be in for 30 years. And at least a nuclear plant is going to be much cleaner than gas and around for 80 years, maybe more. So I think that nuclear has a positive role in supporting the intermittent energies of wind and solar.
So I mean, I agree with you, and I also agree with the commenter. But I mean, there's a lot of talk about grid modernization, so that our grid is going to be a two-way grid, and so the whole grid is being rebuilt anyway. And to now be able to extend the grid into more remote areas where these solar arrays, solar fields of solar arrays might exist, or wind turbines might exist. I agree that there is a cost involved in that, and I'm fine with attaching that cost to the cost of solar or wind. But I think it's part of this larger sort of effort to upgrade and modernize the grid.
I think that the grid should be modernized, but I think that we sometimes are over optimistic on this idea of a two-way grid, and that the grid is going to be able to selectively harvest energy out of my electric car. I can't see that happening for a long, long time, nor can I see people who own electric cars want to let their company pull a juice out of their batteries. So I think some of this stuff is really highfalutin dreams.
Yeah. Along with so on that highfalutin dream idea, we got a question about, did we want to offer any prophecies about fusion? So,
boy.
So you want to take first crack at that?
Yeah, I think that people who are knowledgeable, the electrical engineers, electrical physicists, I'm sorry, the nuclear physicists appreciate fusion more than the rest of the world, because they can foresee that it has some serious advantages over fission. Fusion does not generate much. It does generate some. It generates tritium, although I think the dangers of tritium are way overplayed, but it does generate some tritium. But other than that, you don't get 90%, perhaps even a higher percent you don't get with fusion as compared with fission. So that's a real positive. Yeah. But people have not really dealt with the question when they switch from a coil that has and contains the heat effectively magnetically to using intense lasers to rapidly bombard hydrogen and helium to get energy for a very brief period of time. I don't view that as a major advance. Some people do, but I think that it's a long way off, probably 30 or more years to become commercially feasible to support the grid. 30, I would say, would be a minimum, but some people say no, it'll be sooner than that, and they might be right, but I doubt it.
So you and I are in total agreement on this. I remember taking an energy class when I was in college 40 years ago, and fusion was the next great energy source 40 years ago. And I think here we are 40 years later saying exactly the same thing, that fusion is the next great energy source. And there's no reason to think that we're going to be able to count on fusion anytime. With the timelines that we're using, focusing on the impacts of climate and carbon emissions, fusion is just not, it's not part of the equation.
But I think we agree that it should be supported by research.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there could be other benefits that are associated with combining as opposed to taking apart.
Okay.
So there's a question that has come in. Shouldn't solar and wind economics consider the cost of batteries? So I'm not sure how I feel about that. I do think that the cost of storage is a cost that has to be accounted for. And so whether we're talking batteries or storage in hydrogen or, however we accomplish the storage, because as you said, Richard, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. What are we going to do for those times when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing? Although there is a nice balance between when the sun shines and when the wind blows, but it's not exclusive. So I do think that the cost of storage, cost of batteries, whatever other ways that we do the storage needs to be accounted for.
Yep.
But it gets to the point that I was trying to make in a world with limited resources. And even though we're talking, billions of dollars, or the IRA, which was $300 billion, there are still limits, and we need to, I think, as responsible citizens of the earth and of the, of our country, because we have the budget in our country, to allocate money to where it will generate the most near-term progress towards addressing the challenges and the fears of climate change. And for those reasons, I would rather see those limited resources go to batteries, go to energy efficiency, go to alternatives, and either have the private sector become much more excited about nuclear than it currently is, so that the private sector starts putting substantial dollars in, or the government pause and say, it shouldn't just be us. It shouldn't just be us continuing to invest and continuing to push this technology forward when the private sector isn't ready to be on board.
Yeah, I agree with some of your points. I think that there is an entity called Nucleation Venture Capital. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, or Nucleation Capital, but this is being organized by people who would like to promote private industry into supporting nuclear. So this is happening at the ground level, and I'm actually supporting that organization personally. I think it's a great way to stimulate non-governmental support. The other thing is that we talked a little bit about the competition between nuclear and batteries, and I think that we're in fundamental disagreement there. That I feel that nuclear is, I think you referred to it, somebody did, is an old technology, and I think it has not been given a fair chance in this country. We've abused, even though we discovered it, we've abused the industry. The industry has perhaps abused itself by its poor handling of things, but there's the rest of the planet to be concerned about. And the non-democracies are doing relatively well compared to us. And I think we need to rethink how we're handling this industry. As I look at it, if we had a sudden power collapse of the grid, some people have said, well, how long would our batteries and all of our energy storage devices work? And it would be about 10 minutes, I think somebody said. Not very long. We have a long way to go, and the cost would be enormous. There's one little thing that relates to that, and that is we have been talking about the low-hanging fruit. The low-hanging fruit being electricity and transportation. Well, that low-hanging fruit hasn't been very low-hanging. It hasn't been very successfully dealt with over the past 20 years. What about all the other things that Bill Gates and others talk about? Industry, home heating, management of dairy, changing our diet so that we don't eat so much beef. There are all kinds of things we should be doing in addition to planting trees. And we're not doing very well on those things either. But what I appreciate about Bill Gates is that he's talking about other things than the low-hanging fruit. And I think that if we expect it all to be done with electricity and transportation, we're just not going to do the planet a big favor. We've got to think more broadly.
Right. Well, the last question we have just asked for some speculation. What are China and Russia going to do to reduce their impacts on climate change, their carbon emissions? What about Africa and South America? And what are your thoughts?
Well, I think those are two different, very different things. Africa is a population problem, and unless we educate Africa to control its population, it's going to be a continuing problem. In Russia and China, they are building nuclear reactors as fast as they're building coal plants. Unfortunately, they're going all out on all fronts. I wish that they would cut back on their coal. The particulate matter, the PM 2.5, is getting to be a serious problem globally on pulmonary disease, causing unnecessary chronic pulmonary disease and lung cancers. And aside from a lot of air pollution in many other respects. So we've got to deal with that. And I think Asia is not doing a good job on that yet. All I can say is they've got their own ways of doing things, and they're not going to listen to us. I think the only best thing we can do is set an example. And so far, we're not setting a very good example.
Yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add. I mean, China is in this huge expansion, energy expansion time where they truly have embraced all of the above. And so they're investing tremendously in solar, in nuclear, in wind, in coal, in gas. And I mean, they have billions of people there that are demanding a higher quality of life that energy is associated with. Maybe, long term, we learn something from them as far as what's been successful and what actually has made a difference in the lives of people. But other than commenting on China, I have no additional comments to offer on the other options.
Those are tough questions. We have quite an audience,
Yeah. Richard, thank you. This has been wonderful. Hopefully the exchange of ideas has stimulated some additional desire to poke into this a little bit more among the people that are listening. And thank you for spending your time with us with the Retirement Association. Sandy, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Richard. I know that you've given me a lot of food for thought. I'm sure our audience will agree. I really do like this format and think that many more of our programs should be like this with these point and counterpoints. So again, on behalf of the association, thank you very much for your time, sharing your knowledge and information